courtyard fire, somewhere in Jerusalem, in the middle of the night. A servant girl looks across the flames at a big, weathered fisherman warming his hands and says something simple. You were with him too. And the man who, hours earlier, swore he would die before he ever left his teacher's side, looks her in the eye and says, Woman, I do not know him. He says it once, he says it twice, and the third time, a voice in the crowd presses him. You're obviously one of them. Your accent gives you away. And Peter doesn't just deny it. Luke 22:60 says he began to curse and to swear, saying, I know not the man. And at that exact moment, a rooster crows. Luke 22:60, 1-62. And the Lord turned and looked at Peter. And Peter remembered the word of the Lord, how he had said to him before the rooster crows, You will deny me 3 times. So Peter went out and wept bitterly. That is the image most people carry of Peter, the man who folded under pressure and cried in the dark. But here's something most people never realize. That courtyard was not Peter's first failure. It wasn't even close to his worst one, by some measures. Peter failed loudly and repeatedly, in front of witnesses, for years, both before that night and after it, and every single time. Instead of writing him off, God did something with him that he never did with the people who never failed at all. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to walk through Peter's failures, one at a time, in the order they actually happened, and watch what God kept doing with a man who kept getting it wrong. Because if Peter's story is true, it means your worst moment is not the end of your usefulness. It might be the beginning of it. Start on the water. Matthew chapter 14. The disciples are in a boat miles from shore fighting a storm, and Jesus comes walking toward them on top of the waves. They think it's a ghost and scream in terror. And Peter, only Peter, says something nobody else in that boat would have dared to say. Matthew 14:28. Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water. Jesus says one word, come. And Peter climbs over the side of a boat, in a storm, at night, and starts walking on a lake. For a few seconds it actually works. And then Matthew 14:30 tells you exactly what breaks it. But when he saw that the wind was boisterous, he was afraid, and beginning to sink he cried out, saying, Lord, save me. He took his eyes off the one thing holding him up and put them on the thing trying to drown him. And notice what Jesus does next, not a lecture back in the boat. Verse 31, and immediately Jesus stretched out his hand and caught him. Before the rebuke, O you of little faith, why did you doubt, comes the hand. Grabbed first, corrected second. Here's what's easy to miss standing on dry land reading this centuries later. 11 other men stayed safely inside that boat and never got wet, never got afraid, and never walked on water either. Peter's failure happened in the middle of the only miracle any of them attempted that night. Sometimes you only fail because you were the one who actually got out of the boat. Move forward to Caesarea Philippi and watch how fast Peter can go from the smartest man in the room to the most dangerous voice in it. Matthew 16:15-16. Jesus asks the disciples, But who do you say that I am? And Peter answers first, the way he always does. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. It's the single greatest theological statement in the Gospels up to that point, and Jesus tells him so. Matthew 16:17-18. Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I also say to you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. Read that and you'd think Peter had peaked. Highest praise Jesus ever gave a disciple. And then 6 verses later, in the very same conversation, Jesus starts explaining that he must suffer, be killed, and rise again. And Peter, fresh off being called the rock, grabs Jesus and starts correcting him. Matthew 16:22. Then Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, Far be it from you, Lord, this shall not happen to you. And Jesus turns on him with words sharper than almost anything else he says in all 4 Gospels. Matthew 16:23. But he turned and said to Peter, Get behind me, Satan. You are an offense to me, for you are not mindful of the things of God, but the things of men. Same man, same conversation. From blessed to being called Satan in the space of 6 verses. That's the failure most people never talk about. Not weakness, but confidence pointed the wrong direction. Peter wasn't wrong about who Jesus was. He was wrong about what following him was going to cost. He wanted the crown without the cross, and Jesus wouldn't let that stand even from the man he'd just called the rock. Peter's failures have a pattern, and it shows up twice more before the courtyard. First on a mountain, then in a garden. On the mountain, Matthew chapter 17, the Transfiguration. Jesus is transformed in front of Peter, James, and John, his face shining like the sun, and Moses and Elijah appear beside him. It is, by any measure, the single most overwhelming thing any of these men had ever witnessed. And Peter, unable to just stand still and absorb it, says the first thing that comes into his head. Matthew 17:4. Lord, it is good for us to be here if you wish. Let us make here 3 tabernacles, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. He wanted to build a monument to the moment instead of just letting the moment be holy. And while he's still talking, Matthew 17:5 says, "While he was still speaking, a cloud overshadows them, and the Father's voice interrupts him directly. 'This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Hear him.' Not hear Peter's building plans. Hear him." Then later, in the Garden of Gethsemane, the same impulse shows up with a blade instead of a suggestion. Soldiers come to arrest Jesus, and Peter, again the only one who acts, draws a sword and cuts off the ear of the high priest's servant, a man named Malchus. John 18:10 names him specifically, and Jesus has to undo Peter's zeal on the spot. Luke 22:51. But Jesus answered and said, "Permit even this," and he touched his ear and healed him. Peter was trying to defend the mission and nearly derailed it in one swing. That's the shape of this particular failure. Not cowardice, the opposite of cowardice. Courage aimed in the wrong direction, moving faster than wisdom could keep up with. Which brings us back to the courtyard, and this failure carries more weight than all the others combined because of what came right before it. Hours earlier, at the table, Jesus had told all of them they would fall away, and Peter, true to form, was the loudest voice in the room insisting it could never happen to him. Matthew 26:33. Peter answered and said to him, "Even if all are made to stumble because of you, I will never be made to stumble." Jesus told him plainly that before the rooster crowed, he would deny him 3 times. And Peter doubled down. Matthew 26:35. "Even if I have to die with you, I will not deny you." He meant it. That's what makes this failure different from the others. This wasn't a moment of poor judgment in the heat of an instant. This was a man who had time to think, who had already promised loyalty out loud, who watched Jesus get arrested and actually followed the arresting party into the high priest's courtyard when every other disciple scattered. And then, standing in the one place he chose to be, folded 3 separate times under nothing more than a servant girl's question. Mark's gospel adds a detail Matthew leaves out. Mark 14:72. A second time the rooster crowed. Then Peter called to mind the word that Jesus had said to him, "Before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times." And when he thought about it, he wept. Notice the sequence isn't shame first, and then memory. It's memory that produces the shame. He didn't feel bad and then remember Jesus' words. Remembering Jesus' words is what broke him. That's worth sitting with. Real repentance rarely starts with how you feel about yourself. It starts with remembering what was actually said to you. If you've ever made a promise to God you were completely sure you'd keep, and then watched yourself break it anyway, you're in good company. Literally the man Jesus built his church on. If this is hitting something for you, subscribe. Tell me in the comments which one of Peter's failures you relate to most, and share this with someone who needs to hear that failing God isn't the end of the story. That's how this reaches the next person. Here's where most tellings of Peter's stories stop, at the tears in the courtyard. But John's gospel adds one more scene, and it's the one that actually explains everything that comes after. After the resurrection, Peter goes back to what he knows, fishing. John 21:3. He's caught nothing all night, and a figure on the shore at daybreak tells them to cast the net on the other side. The catch is so large they can't haul it in, and John recognizes what's happening before Peter does. It is the Lord, and Peter, impulsive to the very end, doesn't wait for the boat. John 21:7. Now when Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on his outer garment, for he had removed it, and plunged into the sea. And on the shore, there's a detail easy to rush past. John 21:9. Then, as soon as they had come to land, they saw a fire of coals there, and fish laid on it, and bread, a charcoal fire. The exact same phrase, in the original Greek, used only one other place in the entire Gospel of John. The courtyard, where Peter stood warming himself and denied Christ 3 times. John deliberately puts Peter in front of another charcoal fire, and this time Jesus asks him a question, 3 times. John 21:15-17. Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me? 3 questions, matching the 3 denials, 1 for 1. Not a lecture, not a list of conditions. A question, repeated exactly as many times as the failure had been repeated, until the wound was fully reopened and fully closed in the same conversation. And after each answer, Jesus gives him a job. Feed my lambs. Tend my sheep. Feed my sheep. He doesn't demote Peter after the denial. He doesn't even just forgive him quietly and move on. He puts him back in charge of the flock. The man who couldn't stand up to a servant girl gets handed the shepherding of the entire early church. That is what restoration actually looks like in the hands of God, not a second chance despite the failure, a calling built directly on top of it. Here's the part almost nobody talks about, and it might be the most important one for you to hear. Peter's failures didn't stop the day he was restored. Years later, filled with the Spirit, having preached at Pentecost, having seen the church explode from a small room into thousands of believers, Peter still failed again, publicly, and in front of a church he helped build. Galatians chapter 2. Peter is in Antioch, eating freely with Gentile believers, no restrictions, exactly as God had shown him in a vision back in Acts chapter 10. And then some men arrive from the Jewish believers in Jerusalem, and Peter, under social pressure, afraid of what they'd think, pulls back and stops eating with the Gentiles. Galatians 2:12-13. But when they came, he withdrew and separated himself, fearing those who were of the circumcision. And the rest of the Jews also played the hypocrite with him. Paul doesn't let it slide. Galatians 2:11. Now when Peter had come to Antioch, I withstood him to his face, because he was to be blamed. Paul, a younger apostle, corrects Peter, the man Jesus personally called the Rock, to his face, publicly. This is worth stopping on. Restoration is not the same as immunity. Peter had been forgiven, filled with the Spirit, entrusted with feeding the sheep, and he was still capable of caving to fear years later. The pattern that started with a servant girl's question in a courtyard could still resurface, in a different city, over a different fear. God doesn't fix people once and then walk away. He keeps showing up to the same weakness, over and over, for as long as it takes. If you thought getting forgiven once meant you'd never fall into the same pattern again, Peter's whole life says otherwise, and that's not discouraging, it's honest. If this is giving you a fuller picture of what grace actually looks like over a lifetime, subscribe and share it with someone who's been beating themselves up over falling the same way twice. That's genuinely how this grows. Fast forward decades to the very end of Peter's life. Early church tradition, recorded by the historian Eusebius, drawing on even earlier sources, holds that Peter was crucified in Rome under Nero, around the same years Paul was executed. And tradition adds one more detail, that Peter asked to be crucified upside down, because he did not consider himself worthy to die in the same manner as his Lord. Whether or not every detail of that tradition is precise, the shape of it matches everything you've just watched. This is the same man who once swung a sword to avoid a cross for Jesus at all. And by the end, he's asking for a harder death than the one Jesus received, because he finally understood what he'd once refused to accept back at Caesarea Philippi, that the way up really did run through the way down. There's a scene in John 21 where Jesus tells him exactly this is coming. John 21:18-19. Most assuredly I say to you, when you were younger you girded yourself and walked where you wished. But when you are old you will stretch out your hands and another will gird you and carry you where you do not wish. This he spoke, signifying by what death he would glorify God. The same Peter who once refused to let Jesus talk about suffering ends his own life walking straight into it, without flinching, without a sword, without a single denial. So let's take a breath and look at what we've actually watched. A man who sank because he looked at the wind instead of the hand reaching for him. A man who gave the greatest confession of faith in the Gospels and then got called Satan in the same breath. A man who tried to build a monument to a moment he should have just knelt inside of. A man who swung a sword when he should have opened his hands. A man who swore he'd die before denying Christ and folded in front of a servant girl 3 separate times in one night. A man who even after full restoration filled with the Spirit still caved to fear in Antioch years later. And a man who finally at the very end asked to die in a way that finally matched the courage he'd always wanted to have. Here's what all of that actually says to you. First, the size of your failure is not a measurement of your usefulness. Peter's failures weren't small. They were public, repeated, and specific. A denial under oath, a rebuke sharp enough to be called Satan, a betrayal of the people he was supposed to be leading. And God built the church on him anyway. Whatever you're carrying right now is not disqualifying. It's raw material. Second, restoration is not a single event. It's a relationship that keeps showing up to the same weakness. Peter got restored at that fire on the beach, and he still failed again years later in Antioch. If you thought healing meant never struggling with the same thing twice, Peter's whole life says that's not how it works. Grace isn't a one-time transaction. It's a person who keeps meeting you at the same fire, as many times as it takes. Third, the failure that feels like the end of your story is usually just the middle of it. The courtyard was not Peter's final chapter. It was the chapter right before the one where Jesus handed him the keys to feed an entire movement. If you're sitting in your own version of that courtyard right now, ashamed, certain you've disqualified yourself, you haven't reached the end of your story either. You've just reached the part right before the turn. Somewhere, right now, there's a fire burning. And the question being asked at it isn't, how could you fail me? It's the same question it's always been. Do you love me? Answer that honestly, and watch what he hands you next. If this reframed how you see your own failures, subscribe. Tell me in the comments where you needed to hear this today, and share it with someone still standing in their own courtyard. God bless you.